Welcome. I'm Jessica Morgan, Director of Dear Art Foundation. Thank you so much for coming today for our second Robert Ryman Symposium. We were incredibly fortunate to have four excellent speakers a few weeks ago, up in Dear Beacon. Rob Storr gave a really astounding talk. Courtney Martin, James Meyer, and Allegra Presenti talked about other aspects of Robert Ryman's work, and I think we were all enlightened in many ways by different aspects of their presentations. It was really a fantastic day of talks, and I'm sure today will be no less revelatory, I imagine, in thinking about Ryman's work. It's really been a great pleasure having this time to dwell on his practice. And of course, adjacent to us is the exhibition that Courtney Martin, Associate Professor at Brown and Dear's Adjunct Curator for this exhibition. I hope you'll all spend some time with the works, and if you've not been up to Dear Beacon recently, I encourage you to revisit the works that we have over 5 galleries in the spaces up in Beacon. It's a remarkable body of work, and when you bring the two presentations together, it really is an overview of the extraordinary practice of Ryman, and we're very fortunate to have the works on view over these many months. I want to thank all of the Ryman family, many of whom are with us today, for all their help and generosity in making both of these presentations possible. David Gray, who works very closely with the Ryman family, who's really enabled both the exhibition and many aspects of the Symposia and the future publication that will be out in spring of next year, that will be the contributors from today as well as some additional texts. So we're all looking forward to the record of these two events. I want to thank Pace Gallery, who very generously supported the Symposia and the forthcoming publication. And I want to thank in particular the team here at Dear. All of these events take many people in order to realize. Maria Celli, Mary Catherine, Courtney, of course, Megan Whitko, who worked with Courtney on the exhibition and who's overseen all aspects of this Symposia, and Stephen Hoban, who is our head of publications here, who's been working with Courtney and Megan on the Symposia and the forthcoming publication. I'm going to pass over to Courtney, who'll be doing our introductions. Thank you again, Courtney. It's been a fabulous experience working with you, and we hope to only continue.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I'm going to apologize in advance because I have a creaky voice, but I will make it. I'd like to announce before I move into our introductions that we have one more big event related to the exhibition that will be held on May 31st. This is the Charles Gaines Artist on Artist talk that will be that evening, and he will talk about his own interaction with Bob Ryman and also with Ryman's work. So I hope that you might be able to come for that. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for the second of the 2 gatherings that explore Robert Ryman's long and varied output as a painter. My introductions today will be brief so that we can start what promises to be another great day. Our first speaker is Suzanne Hudson. A champion of the emerging field of contemporary art history, Suzanne is an associate professor of the history of art and fine arts at the University of Southern California. Within her writing on modern and contemporary art, painting, specifically abstract painting, stands out as the medium to which she has devoted considerable scholarly time and energy, beginning with her first book, 2009's Robert Ryman Used Paint, the first book-length study of Bob Ryman. Today, Suzanne will return to the research that supported that volume to look deeply at the artist's practice. Our second speaker is noted anthropologist and jazz scholar John Swed. John is a pioneer in this area of musicology. His writing has furthered popular and academic knowledge about the wide cultural import of Sun Ra, Billie Holiday, and Alan Lomax, among others. His endeavors have taken him to positions at the University of Pennsylvania, Yale University, and Columbia. Today, he will situate Ryman's paintings alongside his first avocation, music. Following in this vein, Fernanda Gomez will discuss Ryman's practice related to her own as an artist working with found objects and a reduced palette. Critics have remarked on Fernanda's ability to imbue her works with a friction between raw material and finished art object, a chasm often bridged by Ryman as well. Born in Rio de Janeiro, where she currently lives and works, Fernanda has shown her work internationally for over 2 decades. Our final presenter is Sandra Amman. Sandra is the co-principal of Amman plus Esterbrook Conservation Associates. A celebrated paintings conservator, Sandra has worked with Ryman since the 1980s. This afternoon, she will draw out the diversity of materials that he has utilized and the ways in which the field of conservation responds to them. At the close of Sandra's presentation, our moderator, Kirsten Swenson, who is the assistant professor of the history of art at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell and author of a recent text on Eva Hesse and Sol LeWitt, will lead a conversation with the panel, which will then be open to the audience. Please join me in welcoming all of our presenters.
Is this a good volume? Yes? In the back as well? Yes? Thumbs up? Okay, that's a good sign. Thank you so much to Jessica and to Courtney for the really kind introduction and invitation to be here. I'm really humbled and honored to be in this company and to be presenting work here today. I also want to thank Megan Whitko for spiriting me here and making this possible, and for David Gray, who I think of as the kind of benevolent and brilliant man behind the curtain. Thank you for so much over so many years. In an unsigned piece on the New York art scene, published in Time magazine in 1968, the magazine alerted readers to a brave new world of art that looked nothing like what they thought it might or should, and that traded in manual dexterity for material self-organization or feats of ideation. Readers were informed that many young artists were flooding New York galleries with work that as yet lacked even a label, quote. Some call it anti-form for its outlines, or rather its conspicuous efforts to avoid them. Others call it process art, for it proudly shows off the marks of the process by which it was made. Another term is conceptual art, for in every case, the concept behind the piece is infinitely more impressive than the workmanship, end quote. Robert Ryman was key to this new critical predicament, and the article discussed him first. A quote-unquote shy, quiet transplant from the South, Ryman lived in, quote, Manhattan lofts and tenements and painted, quote-unquote, naked pictures. That is to say, he covers rectangles of metal, canvas, or paper with white paint, and then, instead of framing them or stretching them, he mounts them as close to the wall as he can get them, sometimes stapling them directly to the plaster. The effect is unnerving. The wall seems to have developed a gaping hole, end quote. And I put up this image here because I think hopefully it performs that very nicely. It was the photograph that attended this piece in this issue of Time. But I'll also use this as a digression. I apologize, I'm very digressive. I'm sure this will be the first of many. But just to use this opportunity to apologize in advance for the paltry nature of the images. I know this came up in the first part of the symposium as well, and it's kind of inevitable in dealing with this work. And I think because we have the rare occasion to see them next door, I thought it was kind of okay to show them, and you can test them against the real things and see how impoverished they really are. But I won't further apologize, but just I'm totally aware of how bad the images are, but that's, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thus the psychic consequence of Ryman's naked pictures for the audience of Time, quote, Ryman's pictures are so unsettling, in fact, that some who see them for the first time laugh outright. Resonating thus with the proverbial conceit of the emperor's new clothes, Time's concentration on barrenness emphasized the farcical blatancy rather than the obdurate materiality of Ryman's nakedness. By virtue of their quote-unquote maddeningly artless look, Ryman's paintings fulfilled an additional function by introducing time's constituency to what, in 1968, comprised an aesthetic form. And this is, I think, something really interesting about this piece, because for all the ways that the author, again unnamed, suggests that this work is provocative, that it's radical relative to even this already quite radical field, and I'll say more about this in a moment, they actually believe that this work, quote unquote, makes the viewer look and feel and think. The artist may speak from the underground, but he retains, in an elliptical way, his traditional role. So in some ways it was provoking a kind of response, the better to kind of obviate that anxiety, but to kind of give it credence and then say, but in fact, this art actually does continue a lot of the kind of more traditional aspects of art heretofore known. Given its date and topical consideration of then nascent process and conceptual practices, the timepiece is an early and avowedly public instance of Ryman's art being slotted into categories of visibility and intelligibility. Even more, coincidence with his emergence as an exhibiting artist, something that happened around the time of this piece, more on which in a moment, his paintings solicited appraisal that not only confirmed qualitative judgments, but queried their relation to art as such. They were, this is to say, understood as radical propositions, even within a field of other such interventions. As time highlighted through mention of works stapled to plaster, Ryman has, in various ways, both before and after, physically opened his paintings up to the surrounding space, admitting a reflexive connection to the gallery. In his words, quote, "If you were to see my paintings off the wall, they would not make any sense at all. When they're sitting on the floor or leaning against a wall, they lose their composition. The line is gone and the color is gone because you lose the wall plane. It's completely unlike the usual painting where the image is confined within the space of the paint plane." In this way, Ryman effects an autocritique, albeit one that asserts, contra the formalist doxa of Clement Greenberg, so active in the same period, who believed in the telos of modernism to medium-specific apotheosis, not the separation of art from the world, but its internal and self-replicating connection to walls, spaces, installations, media, and I think very importantly, people. For Ryman, there is self-consciousness without, or precisely in opposition to, autonomy, which registers materially here, in one side left parallel to the wall, loose from the stretcher, and I hope you can see this kind of on what's the right side of the image, and elsewhere in his employ of obvious brackets and supports, maintenance of sightlines through translucent frames, and here I'm putting up surface veil, allowance for, as part of the considered situation, shadows cast by deep stretchers or works extending perpendicular to the wall, and paintings worked directly onto walls. And here I'm showing you one that you're probably familiar with from Dia Beacon. When he began the last, kind of putting paintings directly onto the wall, he had already been painting for a good decade. This in terms of the time, the paintings on the wall that they referenced in 1968. Though his becoming public happened as others were engaging similar questions of the relation of art to institution. Yet Ryman's moving painting to the wall was but one provisional solution to the problem of how to make a painting. Wow, that looks especially bad. You can hardly see it. So sorry about that. Ryman's career is marked by a careful working over of painting's conventions and their most radically reduced to white paint and support structure, and paradoxically expanded possibilities. This increasingly methodical testing of materials came slowly. The more he worked, the more he knew what could be done and how his work related to that of his peers. But from the first, he painted to see what would happen when, say, a brush made contact with a support. As Ryman recounts of his first foray in 1953, and what you are seeing or should be seeing or could be seeing under other circumstances is the result of his first painting episode. He said about it, quote, "There was a little art supply store on the corner at 60th and Lex. I went there and bought a couple of canvas boards and some oil paint. They didn't have acrylic paint at that time, and some brushes, and I thought I would try and see what would happen. I wanted to see what the paint would do, how the brushes would work. That was the first step. I just played around. I had nothing really in mind to paint. I was just finding out how the paint worked, colors, thick and thin, the brushes, surfaces." While he admits to being tremendously influenced by de Kooning and Rothko in the 1950s, he was never affiliated with the New York school. But expressionist readings stuck early on. As Lucy Lepard poses, quote, "Ryman was soon enveloped by anti-form, although his painting ideas had remained unchanged since the late 1950s, and until 1967, at the time of his first one-man exhibition, his work had been ignored because it was too old-fashioned and expressionist. 2 years later, a Fischbach press release also described his quote-unquote prophetic exhibition at the Bianchini Gallery as being misunderstood by many as a throwback to action painting. And I think this is really interesting because the Bianchini Gallery, which was the site of his kind of public emergence, was where he showed Standard, which was 13 4-foot square paintings of swan's down enamel on cold roll steel panels. So they both set up the opportunity for them being read as kind of minimalist in their seriality, but also expressionist in terms of the kind of facture and the way that each panel had its own composition. And here's a horrible image of that. But to back up, Ryman contributed a painting to a Moma staff exhibition in the museum's penthouse in 1958, near the end of his tenure as a guard, which also coincided with his becoming a painter, and his work appeared in group exhibitions, including a Christmas show at the artist-run Brada Gallery in 1958 and 59, the American Abstract Artists' 28th Annual Exhibition at NYU's Loeb Student Center in 1964, and Dan Flavin's 11 Artists at the Kmart Gallery in 1964 as well. Ryman's inclusion in Lawrence Alloway's systemic painting, about which I'll say little since it was covered so well in the first half of this, exhibit at the Guggenheim Museum in 1966 was a boon in spite of the catalog's few references to his participation. He was still only one of 2 artists without an exhibition history or bibliography, showing that he was still very much emerging at this time. He installed his first one-man exhibition, as I just mentioned, in April 1967 at the Paul Bianchini Gallery at the suggestion of Dorothy Herska, and made the steelworks, in his words, quote, "because I was just looking for a very thin material that would stand up on its own without any backing. Masonite wasn't so good, and neither was aluminum. I thought, okay, steel is really very strong and very stable and very thin. That's how it happened. I looked into it, tested it, and worked it out." The year 1969 proved a crossroads, with solo shows at the Fischbach Gallery in New York and the Triumvirate in Europe of Konrad Fischer in Dusseldorf, Heiner Friedrich in Munich, and Yvan Lambert in Paris. He was also included, among others, in the watershed When Attitudes Become Form, which is curated by Harold Zeeman at the Kunstmuseum Bern, and in Anti-Illusion, Procedures, Materials, curated by Marcia Tucker and James Monti at the Whitney here. Following his contribution to Susan Tamarkin Goodman's 1970 Jewish Museum show, Using Walls, Ryman was granted a Guggenheim Retrospective in 1972 with over 30 paintings and 10 prints and drawings. by exhibiting paintings from only 1965 to 1972 and excluding anything earlier and likely significantly more facture-laden, this first large-scale presentation of recent work neatly sanitized Ryman's production and annulled a decade's worth of painting. While a coinciding John Weber Gallery show, Robert Ryman, Early Painting, sought to redress this void, it was overwhelmed by the larger retrospective uptown. Ryman's visibility in both sites coincided with the popularization of minimalism, articulated chiefly in and as sculpture, and conceptualism in the 1960s and early 1970s. It was largely under these latter rubrics, and not those of 1950s abstract expressionism, that Ryman's aesthetic was subsumed, despite the early reads to the contrary. Even as early as 1972, however, the uncomfortable fit between Ryman and these admittedly internally inconsistent, even heterogeneous fields was becoming more apparent. In the Guggenheim catalog published for this retrospective, Diane Waldman names Ryman as a minimalist, but then recants, writing, quote, "Although Ryman is aligned with the minimalist movement, he has more recently been claimed for both process and conceptual art. These shifting classifications, if somewhat arbitrary, do nonetheless point out the fact that he eludes categorization. This would become a common stance." In a comparable vein, Patrick Frey once dubbed Ryman, quote, "an absolute loner in American painting," while Naomi Spector insisted that he cannot be categorized into any movement. It is thus easy to see the timepiece as prescient, even indicative. And it is so on another count as well. Beyond its making forthright the historicity of reception, it gets at a position of misunderstanding still very much live. I was surprised, though perhaps I shouldn't have been, to discover that the show next door is occasioning comparable feelings of deprivation anew. To take one striking example, Ariella Budick contributed a less than favorable report in the Financial Times in January of this year, charging Ryman with carving out, quote, "but a minuscule niche. He paints only in white. He paints mostly squares. Within these constraints, he allows himself a range of limited possibilities." For that reviewer, this establishes, quote, "a narrowness that also makes it lethally dull. In practice, if one painting amounts to nothing much, 22 of them add up to a slew of nothing much." So I invoke this here not to normalize the position or to lend it credence. Quite the opposite, in fact. Indeed, I personally find it hard to imagine the works as dull or inert, and would instead narrate their differentiation from the wall in terms that follow Kenneth Baker's 1971 review of the Fishbach show, where he wrote, quote, "Most striking, perhaps, is the way that they energize gallery space after a while by being entirely exterior to themselves. Watching them differentiate themselves from mere white is like seeing entropy reversed," which I think is just a lovely idea. To be sure, much of what I will discuss in what follows elaborates on the inverse of Budick's most charged salvo, wherein she asks, quote, "Do unceasing explorations of the same question bring transcendence or the misery of unending boredom? Perhaps there is comfort in confining your thoughts so stringently, since it means the search for meaning has ended before it really began." Instead of her glib certitude, I would put the matter as being one of not knowing, of asking questions that lead to still others, and more, resolution deferred rather than preemptively assumed. In a 1993 interview with David Carrier, Ryman said, quote, "Painting is a visual experience. People can write about historical or philosophical points they want to get across using certain examples of painting, but it usually has very little to do with the painting itself. I do something with the paint, but I'm not painting a picture of anything. I'm not manipulating the paint into an illusion of something other than what the paint does. I make a painting. Painting will go on. Painting is by far not finished. It will never be finished because it's too rich. What could be more challenging than to have endless possibilities? For me, his works open onto a distinct model of painting that has philosophical ramifications for painting more generally, something that I've characterized as his pragmatism and will expand on shortly. Nevertheless, I want to point out the fact that now, in 2016, the fact that Ryman's work elicits this kind of response as what he got in the Financial Times is really quite something. I take it to be symptomatic, in a maybe more positive way, of the gravity of the work, the profundity of its questioning, of its mediums, conventions, institutions, and viewers. Something feels to be at stake still, because it is. Nothing is resolved. The paintings, ever contingent upon effects of light and atmosphere, as well as social responses to them, remain open possibilities and kinds of propositions. There is an endless, relived experiential quality to the work. The intervals of spacing across walls where they exist, as next door, in relation to others, are also related to the passing of time. Look away and back, the paintings are always and never the same. In this way, the context of Dia is remarkable. No period piece this, but work that accords with Heiner Friedrich's stance that, quote, art has no history, and that, quote, there is only a continuous present. For me, anyway, this does not necessarily obviate art history, perhaps far from it, but it does beg the question as to how to write a history of this work when it changes the terms of that history itself, and insists so emphatically on a notion of flux. And it helps to get at the issue of work existing in the present tense that I am trying to articulate here. To put this somewhat differently, let me quote, I think, another brilliant passage written by Daniel Buren, who saw in his friend's work of reduced means and paradoxically expanded possibilities, not vacuity, but plenitude, quote, this teaches us that a profound, analytical, and sensitive examination of painting as an object can be so innovative, rich, and complex and unexpected that initially no one will see it as painting in the true sense of the term. And he's talking here about Ryman's characterization as being not even a painter in the context of when attitudes become form. This was such a powerful argument that the fiercest critics could claim that Ryman's work could in no way be considered painting, and that it is even a pure negation of it, an anti-painting, and he has an exclamation mark there. This work overturns commonly held beliefs about painting to such an extent that it cannot immediately be assimilated as such. At worst, it is considered to be an insignificant object, at best as an intriguing, therefore undefined and unclassifiable object. Accepting it as a painting would mean a re-examination of the painting that preceded it, but would also expand the inner vision that we have about art up until this time, end quote. So ultimately for Buren, and maybe this is the crux even, he says, we can speak of the history of painting before Ryman and after. I agree with this and want to offer in very broad strokes why I think this is so, and why or what the implications of this might be. In short, for me, Ryman's work is an ongoing experiment into painting's possibilities, the models and epistemology of painting, which is to say, a way of knowing the world through painting that rejects ideas of mediums as fixed and self-referential. They are forever enmeshed in the moment of their production, but to no lesser extent than they impinge upon the moment of their reception, and in the latter are ever remade, and in some cases quite literally, and I'm looking forward to the materials conversation to come. But I'm just going to put up one example here, Adelphi from 1967, which had pride of place in Lepard's 6 years, the dematerialization of the art object, because its unstretched linen is accompanied by a wax paper frame that has to be applied fresh with each installation, which means it kind of regenerates itself in each manifestation of the work. In John Dewey's formulation of the experimental method, importance is attached to ideas as ideas. But ideas in his reckoning, or hypotheses, are tested by the consequences which they produce when they are acted upon. In a similar fashion, Ryman's painting crucially derives out of a series of encounters, material, formal, institutional, and social, through which actions unfold out of and respond to discrete sets of circumstances, options, and concerns that are different necessarily for every painting. Results that are achieved in the practice of painting are primary. The painted sign, the support on which it is put down, the edge that rims it and connects it to the wall, and the wall that finally completes the circuit form a kind of empirical relay that justify the painting's existence and potentially generates it as a painting. What a painting is commensurate with what it does, so that ideas are hypotheses to be tested and revised against the consequences in paint and painting that they have produced. Ryman was painting as declarations were being made about painting's demise as a historically potent form. Despite such eulogies, painting's promise for Ryman should not be taken as a head-in-the-sand position. Rather, his experiment gains in significance, is an act of faith perhaps, despite this doubt and possibly because of it. To be willing to believe in the value of doing something, here painting, to act on that belief in the face of skepticism is not a small feat. For the pragmatist philosopher William James, the willingness to act as if and to see what happens thereafter offered the best hope of mediating contingency and adapting to its exigencies, and this is why his pragmatism remained at the level of method. It remained an idea, a social tool, a justification to make choices without at any time suggesting what those choices should be or why they occur in the first place, and a way of being. For James, as for Dewey too, pragmatism never congealed into a totemic ideology except when misunderstood and wrongly appropriated. Meanwhile, James advises, we have to live today by what truth we can get today and be ready tomorrow to call it a falsehood. But this openness at the level of thought as regulative practice does not ensure or valorize acclimatization, nor does it signal uncritical affirmation. It inversely registers mutability as a function of uncertainty about morality and about belief, which, in James's formulation, are less solving names, magic words, or punctual solutions to metaphysical riddles than they are events or even processes to which truth provisionally and contingently happens. Ryman has not operated outside of history. How could he do so? Historicist teleologies or critical narratives. But as Buren suggests, he has dissociated from them to such an extent that we must rethink the applicability of such mechanistic frameworks on the basis of his profound achievement. What beliefs do such systems of thought or modes of apprehension abet and confirm? What does believing in the value of such narratives do for the writing of history or criticism, and how might artists and artworks operate beyond or beneath them? Ryman's work begs for close attention and rewards the concentration expended upon it. Key to his pragmatism, the subject that his paintings solicit is comparably marked by doubts that are commensurate with the rest of practice on which such subjectivity is forged. Ryman's paintings are radically open in their propositions, as I've been trying to suggest. Already in 1969, in a statement for Art and Process 4 at Finch College, Ryman wrote what I think has become one of his probably best-known statements with which you're, I'm sure, familiar. There is never a question of what to paint, but only how to paint. The how of painting has always been the image. Again, his approach guarantees the potential of further production, but not its particulars or consequences. With a full awareness of the fickleness of taste and the volatility of generational approaches to the framing of artworks into culturally intelligible artifacts, Ryman has produced paintings into a present where they might or might not be apprehended. In the meantime, a dialogue about and around his painting can commence and be sustained. By extension, this project moves painting along, but the larger stakes and the specific results, as specific paintings, are perhaps no more certain than are those for Ryman's own work. His most recent show at Pace from 2013 offers, I think, a fitting place to conclude. With 6 small square paintings from 2010 and 2011, and a 10-panel painting from 2010, the show, simply titled Recent Paintings, offered ample evidence of a continued engagement with the medium on these terms. In each of the smaller works, go back to that, a rough square of white oil paint floats roughly off kilter on a stretched cotton canvas. As with his pieces in his 2004 show of white paintings, the white paint is backed by a darkly saturated, light-absorbing ground, pushing the former into visible relief. In this situation, Ryman employed a variety of colors, including deep dove gray, rust, and pistachio. In places, Ryman applied the white with a stiff brush so that the bristles rake fine lines with each thick stroke. This has the benefit of revealing the range of colors that constitute it, creams and yellows, but also lilac and green. The paint, surprisingly matte and seemingly applied in thin, if insistent passes, stains and becomes inextricable from the weave. The 10 panels that comprise No Titled Required 3 from 2010, by contrast, were painted with high gloss, white enamel, and acrylic. As with the other multi-panel works from this series, there were 2 other No Title Requireds, one from 2006 and the other from 2007 to 2008. The work is installed on 2 adjacent walls, traversing a corner. Each of the panels is a different size, although the variance among them is very slight, almost imperceptible, and all but 2 are on birch plywood. The others are on board panel. Again, the differences are near imperceptible, but no less real. Most of the edges are washed in navy, but in places this blue is conspicuously absent, on the left side of the panel on the far left, and on the right side of the 2 panels on the far right. Bookended thusly, the row of panels implies lateral expansion, a kind of opening out on either end. If Ryman engages process as a kind of adaptation to material and the experience that it engenders, it is perhaps crucial to underscore the extent to which this work remains ongoing. When discussing late style, critics often note a tendency toward abrupt shifts in mode, radical changes in method or technique. That is arguably the case here. In the past, Ryman allowed the properties of his supports, whether the dim sheen of steel or the fibrous brown of corrugated paper, to serve as pictorial incident. In these recent efforts, however, the ground is coated completely in paint. But rather than imply some kind of closure, reconciliation with contradiction, or resolution of a life's work, the transition marking these pieces acknowledges that amid the endless possibilities that Ryman once described as the richness of painting, there are only more questions. Thank you.
First, some thanks for some much-needed help from Susan Dunn, names you'll hear again, David Gray, Melissa Kretschmann, Ethan Ryman, Lucy Lepard, Yasmil Raymond, Marilyn Swin, everyone at DIA, and all of you for sitting here. I was going to start a kind of apology by telling you what I didn't know about art, and particularly in this heavyweight company. Then I remembered I actually wrote 2 things on art once, and I was wondering why I didn't remember them. And I think I was very uneasy about what I was doing. The first was a catalog entry of a Southern Yard Art show. You know about that stuff? And this was a kind of bush made of commercial packaging, trash, frankly. And I'm supposed to say something about it, and I didn't know whether you start talking from the top, the bottom. Then I saw a little trash can in there, and on the can it said, handwritten. The only handwritten thing in the piece was "Stick out your can." I said, aha. An obscure Harlem hit from the 30s by the Harlem Ham-Fats called "Stick Out Your Can, Here Comes the Garbage Man." A sort of naughty song. Then I later heard that he said I was the only one who got his piece. So, buoyed up and caught in the fallacy of early success, I moved on to Anthony Braxton, whose titles for his music were all drawings. And the drawings got more complex, they got multidimensional, they got color, they kept changing all the time. So I interviewed him about it, and I said, wanting now to know what the artist says about it, I said, you expect your musicians to read these titles. By the way, one of the things that does, it means you can't write about them because you can't, when you, number one is a picture, you can't write about that, so you have to say, well, the first one was. He said, yes, I expect the musicians to respond to this. And I said, well, what do they mean? He said, I don't know, or I can't tell you. I said, what do you mean you can't tell me? I can't put it in words. Well, that was that. Then one more anecdote. My colleague at Yale, Robert Ferris Thompson, distinguished art historian, was very close to Jean-Michel Basquiat at one point. And he was showing me some things he had done recently. He said, have you seen the Zydeco painting? I said, no. Well, this is a guy with an accordion. It says Zydeco at the bottom, which is kind of Louisiana Afro-French music. And he's got his foot, there's a button accordion, he's got his foot up on a box. It's a green box, and the box says "ver" in French, green. So I said to Thompson, this is very witty, because Zydeco is French Creole for haricot vert. It's kind of spicy green beans. So there's on there, and that's the connection to the title. So he tells Basquiat this, who says, who told you that bullshit? And that would be the end of the story, except as he left, Basquiat came with a notebook and said, now what was that again? And wrote it all down. Anyway, I think that worries me is the idea of meaning and having to talk about it. Well, I'll try to minimize that. First, I'd like to talk about placing Ryman in a larger setting. And the larger setting is that jazz and painting, jazz and art has belonged together for a long time. 1940 at least, the Modern was doing jazz concerts and performances. San Francisco Museum of Art started in 43 with lectures and concerts. And if you really want to go back and allow for some of the sources of jazz, then Dr. Barnes was lecturing on Picasso's paintings and sculpture and their relation to African-American spirituals. I'd love to have heard that lecture. So it's got a long history. And I think, well, let me just say something about 1913. Most people don't count ragtime in jazz, but I do, and it certainly was the blockbuster of the time. And when the Armory show was on in 1913, I kept thinking the big hit at that time was Alexander's Ragtime Band, and surely New Descending a Staircase should have had that as the musical track to go with it. And then I found that Stuart Davis, the youngest painter in the Armory show, said this: there was an objective order in those works which I felt was lacking in my own. It gave me the same kind of excitement I got from the numerical precisions of the Negro piano players in the Negro saloons, and I resolved that I would quite definitely have to become a modern artist, quotes. When he turned to abstraction, he declared that jazz drumming and abstract painting seemed different to me only as craft. In both, rhythm was decisive. Well, jazz and motion pictures and modern dance and modern art were all growing up together, and they shared a number of aims. The word jazz, which may have been indefinable and still indefinable, at least meant modern. Everywhere it went, it signaled modernity. It was the jazz age, after all. And it surfaced in the talk about ragtime, which was something of an obsession and a controversy that reached into sexuality, dress, dance, all sorts of things. And I was foolish enough to start reading this. You could spend a lifetime reading the literature on the reception of jazz. It's just enormous, and it's full of things wanting to shut things down, put people in jail. On the other hand, it was the new horizon coming. In France, it was even more so. Unfortunately, it was tied into what was called negrophilia, which celebrated primitiveness and untutoredness and illiterateness and what have you, and fetishized figures like Josephine Baker, or featherweight boxer Panama Al Brown, or even Duke Ellington. And no wonder Duke Ellington was suspicious of the word avant-garde. When Charles Mingus said, "Duke, even though you're an old guy, you're really cool. Why don't we get some young guys and make an avant-garde record?" And he said, "Do we have to go that far back? Couldn't we just make a nice modern record?" What can I say? Cocteau took up jazz drumming, Mio, Picabia. Man Ray posed as a one-man band with drums and horns and so forth. Improvisation was associated with subconscious, possession, Dada, surrealism. To give you an idea of how excited the French were about writing in jazz, this is René Guéret from his 1933 article, No More Perspective. In jazz, all the elements are brought to the foreground. This is an important law that can be found in painting and stage design, in films, and in poetry of our time. Conventional perspective, with its fixed focus and its gradual vanishing point, has abdicated. In jazz, it's not an accompaniment in songs similar to a figure against the background. Everything works in jazz. There's not a solo instrument against the background orchestra. Each instrument solos while participating in the whole. Each man plays for himself in general ensemble. The same law applies to art. The background is itself as a volume. And a decade later, Sergei Eisenstein was still excited by that, and he said, "We saw here that jazz had multiple perspectives instead of single fixed perspectives, and had erased the strict lines between foreground and background." And then Eisenstein added, "We have only to glance at a group of Cubist paintings to convince ourselves that what takes place in those paintings we had already heard in jazz." Well, I could go on linked with this and bring it up to the gatherings together of what you might call communities of practice, artists and musicians at places like the old Cedar Bar and the Five Spot, and the wide numbers of references to jazz and 50s painting and so forth. But let me turn to Bob Ryman, who turns up in this period. I don't want to be too autobiographical. I wish I was autobiographical to say that he had no thought about painting when he was in high school, but he was listening to jazz mostly on radio from distant stations because it was a severely segregated town. There was no way in which he could hear the real thing, as it were, across town. And when a friend of his named Alfred Bartels, a very interesting person in his own right, better known in Germany than here, came back from New York in 1949 and said he'd studied with pianist Lenny Tristano and how exciting New York was in 1949. Then Ryman got geared up and bought a saxophone, and in his senior year of high school started to play, and continued by the time he got to college. And the second he was playing now in college bands. At the start of the Korean War, he left school to join the Army and played the military band at Camp Rucker in southern Alabama, and also started to gig in local bands. But when he was mustered out in 1952, he immediately went to New York with the $200 and some he got for being mustered out, and stepped into the scene. And I'm going to have to stick close to my reading here because it gets too dense for me. In New York, the new music of jazz was bebop, the most radical form of jazz yet heard, one created by a small group of organic music intellectuals disguised as recently arrived farm boys from South Carolina or Oklahoma. They had emerged from the popular jazz music called swing and announced themselves in a show of musical effrontery. Bebop was a self-consciously unpopular music that was played fast, relentlessly, and required close listening and great technical skill. To add to the distance from the pop world, bop musicians sometimes dressed as stereotypical artistes or bohemians, speaking in argot of hip, naming their tunes with nondescriptive and off-putting titles like anthropology, epistrophe, or ornithology. It was the excited music of ex-soldiers and traveling musicians who missed the military draft, and it mimed their experience of wartime strikes, discrimination, and dislocation. Bop melodies and rhythms were asymmetrical and jagged, supported by extended or altered chords. The notes that were not found in the chords, that is to say, and would normally have appeared and quickly passed between the chords, were now emphasized. So they're taking the notes that were out of the chords, which were frankly discordant if emphasized, and emphasizing them as they moved through the chords that would be non-discordant. To the audience, as one Miles' brother said to me, it sounded like somebody's, a windstorm and the clothing is out there flapping in the breeze. I said, what does that mean? He said, it's unresolved, man, it's unresolved. But it's a way of hearing, right? Previously, jazz musicians had improvised solos on the melodies and harmonies of well-known songs, but always been careful to play the original melodies at the beginning and the end of each piece so the audience would know the themes they were varying. But beboppers composed entirely new melodies on the chord structure of older pop tunes without ever revealing their sources. So a Sweet Georgia Brown could be by Coleman Hawkins could be turned into Hollywood Stampede, or by Thelonious Monk into something called Bright Mississippi. The old subliminal melody peeking through the new one. Maybe you see where I'm going with this. It was what the musicologists would call a melodic contrafact, which in classical music was usually a form of homage or even parody. But for bebop, these compositions with their ghostly subsurfaces created a tension that opened up new possibilities for invention. Fans and music critics, still tethered to swing and perplexed by bebop, would call this Chinese music. An ethnic dismissal I've noticed also turned up against the abstract painters. I can't figure out why Chinese. They were saying that about John Coltrane, who was studying Indian music, which is weirder. So Ryman came to town to study with Lenny Tristano shortly after he arrived in 1952, and he continued his study for the next 2 years. A sidebar here, Phil Glass was turned down for him, but Bob got in. Tristano was a blind pianist who was not well known as an innovative musician, in part because he seldom played in public. But he had over 1,000 students in his lifetime, so he was influential as a teacher. Time magazine called him, it's a wonder he ever got in there, the Schoenberg or the Bartok of jazz, neither of which is correct, but it indicated he was being taken seriously. And how seriously? In 1957, in the movie Jailhouse Rock, Elvis Presley, playing an ex-con with musical talent, is asked by a college professor at a cocktail party what he thinks of Tristano's latest record. And with a mouth leer, he says, "Lady, I don't know what the hell you're talking about." And he walked out the door and it was popped, and I guess on it went. Tristano was by temperament a bebopper, but one who was also expanding the harmonic possibilities of jazz and restoring long-abandoned collective improvisation. He was also one of the first to experiment with multi-track recording, superimposing different rhythms one on top of the other, manipulating the speed of tapes he'd recorded. These are practices which were thought of by most people as cheating, as a kind of anti-jazz. His answer was, if I could learn to do these things without doing that, would it still be wrong? Interesting answer. People say, you know, that's not the real thing you're doing there. Many musicians and fans considered him the whitest of the new jazz musicians. No art pun intended here, by the way. That is to say, a musician who was passionless, cold, too intellectual, too experimental, too arty, too unswinging to play the music that had been developed and first mastered by African-American musicians. In retrospect, it's a charge that was patently unfair by its nearsightedness, unfair both to Tristano and to black musicians like Charlie Parker, who was the god of the beboppers who loved to play with him. And also, Tristano was spoken well by Miles Davis and Charles Mingus. I had a friend in high school who studied with Tristano just at the time when Bob would have been studying, so I think I can speak with some authority because she kept telling me what the lessons were like, and I checked this with other people as well. The first thing was that he would pick out outstanding solos of music and then ask you to memorize them and come in and sing them. And once you got the singing down, he would tell you to write it out. Kind of double transcription here into the body and then into the music. And then he would start other things like, well, now play it with your little finger, or then work your hand one finger at a time and keep going with singing over and over again, the same kind of people. He was also interested in fundamentals, practicing scales and arpeggios, working with small fragments of melody in different keys. The most unusual facet of Tristano's pedagogy was his effort to help his students confront their social and musical blocks to creativity, and use neurosis and anxiety in every statement about this, and particularly the way New York was receiving new arts. But it was an era when, in the same town in which Auden wrote his poem, The Age of Anxiety, and Harold Rosenberg was talking about anxious art objects. But Tristano had an answer to this. The students should go to so-and-so, I've forgotten the name, learn about Wilhelm Reich's theories of sexual liberation and orgone creativity. That's where my friend quit. She said she didn't go for fee splitting, and one doctor sending you to another and whatever. But by the way, that was also something common among painters. If you don't know about the orgone box, Google it. When Ryman was accepted in Musicians Union, he began playing in village clubs like the Champagne Gallery, a nice place, by the way, on McDougal Street, or Arthur's Tavern, which is still there on Grove Street, where Charlie Parker sometimes played. Since these were mostly non-paying gigs, he supported himself by working as a messenger, a mailroom clerk, and other small-time jobs. When he took a job as a guard at the Modern in 1953, in part because the museum's hours of 11 to 6 left him more time for late rising after nightly visits to the old Birdland in Midtown of Savoy and Harlem. Plus, he was allowed to practice in the auditorium when nothing was going on. And his remark on that was they were very generous to young artists. It was the beginning of a great education, the best I could have had, he said. After a year at the Modern, he told Tristano he was giving up lessons because he wanted to become a painter, and Tristano tried to get him to do both at the same time. He said, you're a good musician, you can be better, and so on. But Ryman was taking painting seriously and wanted to devote himself to it. And he immersed himself in self-study with materials and the discipline of painting, and again, practicing alone in his room. I gather that some who write about art apparently worry about the art object when it's difficult to talk about, especially an object that resists the usual norms of art talk, as does Ryman's work. Anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss said, when an art object whose code is known comes to Paris, they send it to the Louvre. When they don't know the code, they send it to the Musée de l'Homme, which is the anthropology museum. That's not a joke, that actually happens. There used to be a program in Philadelphia at one of the museums called What in the World? And they would hold up things and say, is this art or not? Way before Dante and those people. A piece of gear shift or something or other. Jazz-like art resists definition, is difficult to describe. For jazz, like most music, is finally about nothing but itself. And Walter Pater's famous insistence that all art aspires towards the condition of music doesn't help the writer, for no one says that all criticism should aspire to the status of music criticism. In fact, they say writing about music is like dancing about architecture, which is to say, don't do it. Does anyone say that about art? Don't do it? Yeah. Ryman sometimes frustrated art writers when he was reticent to talk about his work, but he was not often asked about his music and its relation to painting. And what I did was go back to the many interviews that he's given, and I found that when he was asked about painting, he often responded as if he were a musician, or especially from the perspective of a bebop musician. Thinking that what he said about music at those moments was helpful in understanding his painting, I pulled together some of his comments from a number of interviews and grouped them to form a few short narratives. Here he's been asked about his painting, and he turns immediately to music. I wanted to compose with my instrument, to improvise, to find out all the things you can do with an instrument. In that respect, it's related to painting. What's important is the composition, the discoveries you make while working. Painting really resembles music in that way. You develop something, and then you take the part that interests you. That's how it happened. Here he is again, other place. I came from music, and I think that type of music I was involved with, jazz, bebop, had an influence on my approach to painting. We played tunes. No one uses that term anymore. It's all songs now, telling stories. Very similar to representational painting, where you tell a story with paint and symbols. But bebop is swing, or more advanced development of swing. It's like Bach. You have chord structure, you develop that in many ways. You can play written compositions and improvise off of those, so you learn your instrument, and then you play within a structure. It seemed logical to begin painting that way. I wasn't interested in painting a narrative or telling a story with a painting. Right from the beginning, I felt that I could do that if I wanted to, but that wouldn't be much of interest. Music is an abstract medium, and I thought painting should also be just what it's about and not about other things, about stories or symbolism. Asked about, was there much overpainting in his work? He said, no, never. If I miss, then there isn't any overpainting. It just has to be right the first time. It's actually very much like playing jazz now that I think about it. It's that kind of thing. It's when you're playing an instrument and you're composing as you play, there isn't any second chance. Once you play, that's it for all time. Here he is speaking about his life in music and painting. There must be something about the relationship between art and music that makes a transition from one to the other easy and natural in some way. Maybe it's all just patterns and deviation. Maybe in the same way a jazz player plays the melody straight the first time and then rewrites the melody for the solo choruses. Good art sets up a structure that everyone is familiar with, square mounted on a wall with paint on it, for example, and then departs from the expected tune, inspires you to go home and think or blow your own horn. I might just mention in here, Jelly Roll Morton, the person who claimed to have invented jazz, said that jazz was not a thing or a kind of tune, but a way of playing, a musical methodology, so that the subject could be anything, and he used anything, rags, vaudeville songs, Puccini, pop tunes, marches, and he said, it's all in the operator. A couple more remarks on Ryman. My paintings have no prototype. They're done without working anything beforehand. I don't do any studies. I don't myself know what it's going to look like until it gets to the point where I can see what's happening. Ryman has said that he prefers to name a painting instead of giving it a title because he's not creating a picture or making reference to anything except the paint of the materials. To assure that the words could not be associated with other things because, quote, that would be disastrous, he said, he took the names of his paintings from the names of the materials he used, the brushes, the supplier, and so on. Though that's generally true, it was not always true. About 10 years after he'd given up playing, he borrowed some of his paintings' names from jazz compositions. They include Love Lines from Lenny Tristano, which is based on Fool and Myself, Billie Holiday tune, or One Down from Harold Land's composition on the album The Fox, Back Talk, a Woody Herman orchestra piece, Single O, another Woody Herman piece, and Untitled, in parentheses, background music. That's sort of a Migrette kind of thing. Untitled, and then it gives you a title. Background music. Let's park on that for a second. There is background music, and of course, I have to say it always doesn't look right, but you can go next door and see it. And now, let's see if I can clear my paper out of the way. I want to point out that one of the people he knew and studied with at this time was Warren Marsh, who was a tenor saxophonist like he was, and one of Lenny Tristano's favorite students that he worked with in clubs and so on. And he had a piece that's still being played by some musicians called background music. And background music is based on the chord structure of pop tune All of Me. And this is probably an unwise choice because she never sang anything as written, which is already improvising. But here's background music by the Tristano group. As I say, a tune based on the chord structure of All of Me. Maybe you can hear it. And where did it go? There. And this is the kind of music that he would have heard surrounding Tristano and with his studies with Warren Marsh, who, by the way, came from a very art-oriented family. His father was a cinematographer for MGM. His mother was a classical violinist. His aunt was a well-known star in silent movies with D.W. Griffith and so on. His other person he worked with for a while was Bill Evans, who is normally not associated with being an arts person, but his little note on the back of Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, where he discusses Japanese painting, which requires very thin paper and very careful discipline, that you not change what you're doing because it could punch through the paper. He makes analogous to a kind of jazz in which every mistake has to be anticipated and worked with and avoided and so on. So I want to make an untutored guess about this, tutored because I don't know what he had to say about it, about what he meant in this, and that what connects the Warren Marsh tune to the painting of the same name is that both place one thing over another, but not in a deceptive way, or it doesn't depend on you knowing the other. If you know it, that's fine, and so forth. Occasionally musicians will use the phrase, we put one picture over another, talking about their variations on this. Again, this is a basic practice of bebop musicians and what he was working with. I won't rule out the possibility, of course, that he was just alone playing Warren Marsh's background music as background music to painting, especially as he often painted when he was working, but his comments about other paintings make this an unlikely possibility. For example, this one, to the redoubtable Dahlia Aldrich, who was flirting in her article in the London Telegraph, as I recall, with saying this is just nothing. He says, she asked him, how did he go about doing this? And he said, I don't remember the process. There are probably all kinds of things going on there. It didn't start with orange, I'm sure of that. And pointing to the specks of green showing through and around the sides of the canvas, he said, that's important. On other occasions, he said of other pictures, they're not white or monochromatic paintings because the surfaces function as a second color in contrast to the white of the paint. Or in another place, it was a matter of making the surface very animated, giving it a lot of movement and activity. This was done not just with the brushwork and the use of quite heavy paint, but with color which was subtly creeping through the white. There's a centuries-long and rather complex history of many attempts to turn sound into something visible. But even if we limit ourselves to the subset of that kind of effort, which was inspired by jazz, and its attempt to render that into painted images, the variety of efforts is impressive. No one I know of has tried what, in jazz at least, what Wassily Kandinsky wanted to do by turning musical notation into a new geometric vocabulary. That is not the sound of it, but the notes as written on the page, then turned into a painting. Perhaps for no other reason than that written music is not a primary interest to jazz musicians. Harry Smith, who I'm working on at the moment, did several visual translations of jazz recordings, such as his 1952 painting Menteca, based on a Dizzy Gillespie record of the same name, and he performed these paintings, if you will, by while the record was playing, he had a pointer and he was tracking it through the picture. An artist friend of mine said to me, could a musician read this painting? And I thought, that's interesting. No, because it's the painter's language has created this. And then I got to thinking, well, chord symbols, for example, are extreme abstractions. They're not really what the chords are. And that's why amateurs who follow the chords on a written piece of music invariably sound like amateurs. And then further, I mean, transcription of music into notes is itself an abstraction, and one that drives a lot of composers crazy, and some who, particularly these days, fill their stuff where almost every note is marked with it. Have you seen this stuff? Where every note is marked with what you should do with it. And musicians are good enough these days to sort of look over that and fly through it. And it's stunning, but odd. Arthur Dove in the 1920s did paint from recordings and daringly attempted to produce works that were the visual equivalent of the feelings and sensory qualities involved in the art of playing music, recording music, and listening to music, and doing it all on a single canvas. There's also one contemporary painter who attempts to take into account the difference between a recording and a live jazz performance, Jeff Schleiner, who calls himself the music witness. He paints the performance in real time, starting when the musicians start and stopping when they finish, mimetically capturing the look of the musicians in action, but producing an abstraction of what the music sounded like. He often sits on the stage with them. Robert Ryman is much more modest in what he is doing in the few of the paintings named after his recordings that I've seen, and it's a modesty that follows from what he wants to do in his paintings. He's creating the visual equivalent of the form and the organization of a certain type of jazz, one that was originally developed in interaction with others, through performance, rather than through solitary composition. And this kind of collective process of aesthetic through performance makes the music not just a style, but an ethic. It's a system of morality, if you want, that goes with this, a way of relating to people. And it appears to me that Ryman is alluding to ethic, and it may also tell us why he paints while listening to music. It's not just to fill the air, it's to set up this connection. This is interesting if you pursue this in soloists, when solo performances are done by jazz musicians like Sonny Rollins, for example. He alludes constantly to other people in the music, if you know this stuff, so it's not just him singing alone. And for that matter, in African-American folk music, there's a lot of doubling with the same voice. That is, you'll sing a phrase and then answer it with another voice, as if another person was there. There may be different languages in which to talk about these two art forms, yet there are similarities between the practices of both of them, which, at least in Ryman's work, sometimes seems to outweigh the differences. I was going to quit here, but let me add this other paragraph. This is, I guess I'd be talking here if I went on about comparative aesthetics, which has never really taken hold in universities, which would be not just, Indian, painting in India versus painting in New York, but between the different arts, what their relationships are and how they work. Let me end with the words of another artist, this time a novelist, the Argentine Julio Cortázar, from an article called Take It or Leave It, in which he's offering an example of how it's possible for one art to learn from another. He's talking about how jazz musicians think about takes being in the early days of recording, there were so many mishaps between the crude recording material and the pressing material, they made multiple versions of them, so if they broke, they could use that. So they were always different, each one is different. They were called takes, and takes are very valuable among musicians when they can see how people were working at the time. And here's what he says about this. These takes are sometimes complete, and sometimes so wrong they're interrupted in the middle of them. But recordings can provide us with a view of the workshop of the artist. The difference between practice and the take is this. Practice leads little by little to perfection, what it produces doesn't matter. It's present only as a function of the future. In a take, creation contains its own criticism, so it often interrupts itself to begin again. The inadequacy or failure of a take has the value of practice for the one that follows, but the next one, the next take, is not an improved version of the preceding one. Rather, if it's really good, it's always another thing entirely. And Cortázar concludes, as I will, by saying, the best art is always a take. There's an implicit risk in its execution, a margin of danger that's the pleasure of the flight, of the love, carrying with it a tangible loss, but also a total engagement. Let everything we do be a take. Thank you.
Thank you all, and yeah, you may say whatever you like during my presentation when you wish, and thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here, honored and nicely nervous. And so it's the first time I'm talking about the work of somebody else, which I'm not doing, in fact, probably. There are so many possibilities, and this is not a quote, it could be, but it's not. To start with, I would like to start with silence, maybe, even if silence does not exist. So, yeah, silence is when you hear the beat of your heart, and my heart is really beating. So, maybe the best situation for being in front of an artwork is to be there, which seems obvious, but it's not. So I thought since the beginning about the ideas of silence and presence, which in a certain way can be so linked, because it's also in a certain way impossible to be where we are fully, but I always try to develop this idea of full presence. It could be just like breathing, simple, no, we are where we are. I love this sign, maps, you are here. I said, am I? You know, like, are we really there? And in which measure are we really where we are? So I feel free when I talk about my own work to talk about everything else but the work, because also the work prefers silence than words. And I love words, but they are too mysterious in a certain way. It's enough to speak more than one language to realize how many words lacks all the time. So for the verb to be in English, we have 2 verbs in Portuguese, 2 verbs in Italian. This makes a difference, but the thing is that we can't talk about art, in fact. This is a kind of utopia, and I like utopia, and I like big challenges, so that's why I'm here. And normally, to feel more comfortable, I always say like that, please interfere if you wish, so I can feel more relaxed. But attention is very good too. So this idea of rhythm and I was feeling well also to read a bit about Ryman's own ideas about what he's doing, because I feel more or less in the same way, that things are what they are. We don't need more than that. We just need to be there, and we just need to be there. But it's such a big challenge to be there. I was thinking also, what should I have? I never made notes, and but even if I didn't want it to, I made a few notes, which I don't know if I will follow, because I'm not afraid of losing myself in my natural way. I'm afraid of losing myself in what I've written about. So I thought about talking about white in the beginning, because I just use white paint myself. It's good because you never have really dirty nails, and when you have its white paint, it always seems so clean anyway. And I like some bad jokes too, sorry. And but then I had a very fresh memory of the rooms at Dear Beacon, which for me it was such a great pleasure to see and to be there, and so I thought about talking about white, and then I saw the exhibition here, and they said, but there's so much color. Why people don't talk about all the time about white? There's so much color, even a red and green and blue, not only the raw material colors, which I'm also familiar with, but color, real colors, red, green, yellow, everything. So how could we approach to this work in a kind of a silence way? Because we are so used to noise, we are so addicted to noise, we are so comfortable finally with noise, and I think this feeling that silence is when you hear your heartbeat. This was something which when I was not even wanting to, I was writing a bit, so this feeling that ultimately the real silence is just death, no? But we are talking about life, and okay, art is a very special form of life which can include overcomes. Yeah, I apologize for my poor skills of English anyway, or limited, not so poor, but limited, very limited. So how could we, and then I thought that we could also, like the antidote is made by poison, so I always like starting by silence, because then we can, in a certain way, find a reference to this absurdity, which is talking about art anyway. And I like absurd things, so this, what it makes it real. And in a certain way, what it counts more for me, it's emotion. So when you see a painting, it's a kind of freedom that you experience, that it's much more than silence in a certain way. It's a kind of freedom that it allows you to think in a completely different way. It allows you to connect to another soul in a completely different way. And this makes us able to connect with people in a way that just art allows us to do. Not even the most closest relationship, we are able to touch a soul in that way. And we have the privilege also to be in contact with people who lived in so many different times and so many different situations, and they are all there, fresh, for us to connect with. So to get back to Ryman, my first connection to his work came surprisingly quite late, because first I was just seeing like some works in museum collections, never a show. And then in 2001 I was in Austria and making an exhibition, and I came to Munich to visit a friend, and I saw the exhibition there. I was doing a painting, to say very much between, which was a square, white, perpendicular thing against a wall, which I had no idea what I was doing there. And I came to the exhibition, I saw exactly the same thing. I felt so happy, so delighted to... Because then finally you are not alone anymore. I was thinking before I was talking about him as a musician, that to switch from music to art should be such a difficult thing, because we are so alone. I always envy music, because you all the time exchanging and working together in such a perfect way, and then we get back to our own thing in visual arts, and we are so much alone. For sure, we connect to everyone in art, but not in real time, so it's different. So I have so many topics that, so excuse myself also. I won't excuse myself for my dispersion, because I actually like it very much. Everybody always tells us to be concentrated, but I think dispersion is a very important way of attention, that you are aware of everything. So when I see you all here, I feel, very moved also. And so everything is just so. One thing about the square or lots of colors or small paintings, this is good. Why small paintings for me are so important? Because the situation when you really forget about everything else, because you approach so much to the painting that even the space disappears. And I'm very glad when I see like this difference of sizes, and then the day I saw the exhibition first, it was completely empty and I could see much better, but then today it was full of people. But then you approach to a small painting and then you're free from everything. You just have you and the painting. And the scale they have, it's, even if there's also the square format, it's why the square format, Malevich, anyway, why square? I was asking myself, because I do square things all the time, so square paintings. One day I just had the idea, just because they are not vertical, neither horizontal. Obvious, no? I took like 10 years to arrive to this conclusion. Maybe more. And so, in fact, I think we don't know much about what we do, and I like this way, because mystery for me to be according to mystery is to accept it. We don't understand much. And I think the idea that we have about understanding and even enlightenment is a kind of abstraction also, but maybe abstraction is the most concrete things. So, like things that are what they are really, or I was very glad also to hear today that this situation that when you have something on the wall, it's something, and when you take it from the wall, it seems to be nothing. I have the same problem, which all the problems, I think, in fact, they are positive, not negative, like being not able to reproduce a work of art, because not one single work of art is able to be reproduced. Some of them, like Ryman's, are much more difficult. Impossible for sure, but all of them are impossible. But this just points to it, or like also staring to a wall, it's considered to be just things that fool people does. But then painting really makes you do that. Not only you see the wall, but you see the wall as something which is alive, that you can see if it was painted as with a brush or with a roll, or which kind of roll even. And I forgot about counting the time. Okay. So I was also thinking about time, to talk about time, like how long should we gaze at a painting to see it? It's endless. The ideal, it would be to have all of them in our, not house necessarily, but in our neighborhood to be able, but it's good to see a painting in the dark also when you get up and you, in the middle of the night, and you don't put the lights on. But the most important is how could we really connect fully to a painting? And I think Ryman is emblematic, his work is emblematic in this sense, that treats painting as something in a completely different reference, also this way of saying that, for sure, through painting, because everything I can say here, in fact, doesn't count. It's nothing for me. So, for sure, it counts a lot, but that never touches the work, really. So, no matter what we can tell about, even if I'm talking about my work, it doesn't, it's not important. So the only important thing is the work itself. But how can we be, or turn out to be, or develop ourselves to enjoy it fully? I think this is a big challenge, even for insiders, even for artists, even for how could we develop the ideal conditions. So first I will be this idea of silence. How could I just quiet all parallel information and just go to essential? And some works makes this happens. That's why people laugh. I think even when people laugh, can be good. You know, you can cry, you can laugh, you can smile, you can feel like dancing, you can feel like inspired. And this is very important because I feel that all artworks are linked in a quite a beautiful, irregular net, or since the first guy who put his hand on the wall in a cave and spit some pigment to have his hand. Yeah, Miro says a funny thing, that painting is in decadence since cave's time, which I do not agree, but I think it's quite nice. So I think painting also allows us to see the world in a completely different way. Lately just 2 weeks ago, I was reading that the police department somewhere, they're just giving painting lessons to their staff for teaching them to look. And in this way, I think art really transformed the world. We will never be able to see things if it wouldn't be art in a certain way. Like, so being here and seeing this wall and seeing this, we can see it in a completely different way because of painting. Yeah. Another thing which I really like, I feel very happy to see works that talks about modesty. A very ambitious modesty, I must say, because it's, I think, one of the highest ambitions is to be really modest. Modest is a kind of knowledge, not really, a kind of, the problem is that words lacks all the time, and then we try to grasp something, and then in English you have seize, grasp, many words, clutch, blah, blah, blah. In Portuguese there is none. And then you know that there are words lacking all the time, so how can we navigate in this kind of territory which is so dangerous? Because at the same time, nobody was never hurt by a painting, and people are hurt by words. It's enough to say a bad word and people are still hurt. And I thought that maybe we could say, like having a painting to translate something, or just making this kind of foolish games about language. And the problem, I think, that nowadays, visual language is not sufficiently understood or cared much about, because everything should, like verbal language was always the highest kind of expression of philosophy or poetry. I have no problem about it. I love verbal language, but I think that there's a kind of situation that we should separate one from the other one. Yeah. So I wanted to do a performance. So Savage Cage made it much better than I did. So then I could do. The thing is that you get just in this kind of void, which I think it would be the ideal situation to start with, again and again and again. And then when I was reading a bit his own statements, which were so simple, so nicely avoiding all this kind of reduction that verbal language usually does. Like, I don't make white paintings, for sure not, it's evident. And also white as a color for me is such a powerful color, but people say there's no color in white. I can't understand either. And just the idea that a painting is an object, which for me it's a very primary ideal situation. My own practice is just like that. I was never able to see a painting as a flat thing. So for me, painting always have three dimensions. And also, it's a material, it's something that you can hold many times, or many times you don't need to. But this is what you see, and when you have a kind of painting that makes you see what is the object itself, I think it turns into yourself, and then you can perceive yourself as a viewer in a completely different way as well. And I'm not afraid of talking the obvious, as I'm doing here all the time. Maybe we don't say the obvious as much as we should. You know, when you say white, I say, which white? You know, because you always say dark green, but you never say, okay, you can say warm white, or bluish white, or grayish white, but there will be never dark white, I think. There's off-white, but not dark white. But if you have a dark painting in the dark, it's a dark white, or not. Nobody knows, you know, like even a color is a kind of mystery, because everything we see, it's not what we are seeing. In fact, white is absorbing all the colors. So I don't want to be too literal in the silence anyway. But it's funny when you have a time, and then when you think about 1 minute of silence, which is always kind of homage to someone who is dead. And I think we should make like minutes of silence to our lives presently, you know, much more than we do normally. And I'm not talking about meditation or mindfulness or nothing of that. Just trying to not fulfill what is expected from us in a certain way, or to try to be as free as possible. And it's so hard, it seems. I was reading something this morning which I really liked. It's when a painting is ready, it's when it feels like it's natural. It seems like there is not much effort in it. You just feel it's nature. It is something. And how can you know that. It's a mystery again. So maybe it seems that I'm not talking about anything. I hope it's not too boring, but I'm just talking about what it seems for me the most important thing about art is just to try to reverse the situation. As it's, in my perspective, I feel that talking in a way that finally we could, I do this for myself in first place, which is the best I can offer. The feeling that you're still like wordless, and also the feeling of love, because when I think about modesty in this world which is so violent, and having this frequency of a kind of human scale, which is human also because it's so beautifully imperfect. There's a kind of imperfection in his work which captivates me a lot, because it's a kind of tenderness. You feel that it's a feeling of love in every brushstroke, maybe. It's a real feeling of love. That everything is put in value. The screws are important. Everything is important, and everything is. There's a non-hierarchical way of producing an artwork. It's nothing which is there stating a kind of. It's a different kind of strength. It's a kind of. Human strength that there's not there to. You feel that when they say that, okay, my child could do this, which is such a cliche for contemporary art, I take it positively. You know, I think it's a good thing, because it seems like effortless, even if it's so difficult to do, even if it requires a complete dedication. And it turns to be something that you can see yourself in as fragile as you are really. We are trying to pretend all the time that we are strong, and we can be quite strong, but this is a beautiful illusion. And I think artworks have this capacity to put us back to our nature, which is this fragility, so exasperating fragility that we try to build, to go to the moon, to do all these kind of things just to prove that we are so incredible, and we are not. We are just, I think, okay, if you see towards art perspective, yes, we are an incredible race. Yeah, I was thinking also about the idea of jazz, improvisation. I was reading also, you know where you start from, you never know how things will develop, which it's a process very familiar to me, and you can see it in the paintings themselves. You don't need to read that as a statement to know that there's something there, that it's a kind of joyful and sensual, especially sensuality. Also this kind of, that mind, we have this idea that mental will be, even if we can I think we cannot separate, but the language obliges us to separate mental from emotional from physical. There's not one word in the languages I know that could put everything together. So our culture makes you separate what is mental, emotional, and then art each day more is a kind of mental issue. Even if it's very mental, I think it's have the kind of sensuality that free us also from the idea of control. And also everything which seems contradictory for me seems also complementary. So you can say one thing from one perspective just to see that the other perspective will be interesting too. And then the paintings are there, and they are materially always the same, but they are changing all the time, depending on how we see them. Not only, it's beautiful to see in the exhibition when you have natural light, and light for me is also an essential issue, and it's beautiful to see when you have natural light and you have light changings, and I've seen it this first day. It was a very changing day, so I have lots of different lights for the same painting, and staring there and they will last, and they always will have this freshness. And they will, I feel also that when you have this highly inspiration, like Malevich, for instance, which worked a whole revolution in 6 years, till he was obliged to do different things. And there were so many possibilities. This was a kind of key words today, also reading again Ryman's statements about many possibilities, all the times many possibilities, just like I feel like so many possibilities. And even if you live a long life, productive and devoted, you will always open some ways that you wouldn't be able to follow because there are too many possibilities. And then it's very important that this, like, it's 100 years, it was 100 years last year from Malevich. And there are still so many possibilities to be developed there, and then when we can, like, see more how things are going from one to the other one, like I don't care about originality. I think this is an idea which is against the idea of art, because if it will be too original, we will be in a fool asylum, not in a museum. So I think it's very good that it's not that original. So we do, all of us, I think, what we had received and what we are passing. So still we need to see a lot, and I'm always concerned how long one painting has been how long you take to make one painting and how long you take looking at it to know it is a real painting, and how long could each of us, even being living with a painting, to enjoy it fully, or I think it's endless. So I think the question in a certain point is, and I think Ryman have the best formation that we could dream of, being a god for so many years and being there looking, and this is something that it's better than any art school in my vision, that just look. And how can we start learning each day more to look? Fortunately, there's painting. And maybe it's funny because a sculpture makes you move. Okay, a painting also, because a scale is also something that you approach to and you get, so the dimension is something related to how close you are from the object. So the moon seems so little from here, and so how you move to see a painting, or how can we enhance this experience? There's not an answer for that, for sure, just a practice, just a yeah, I think all the small topics I wrote about. But I could talk endlessly, but I think maybe it's time to stop with a beautiful silence again. Thank you.
Sandra, I want to jump right in and ask you where you started as a conservator. Conservation, I think from the outside perspective, as an art historian, conservation is this field in which everything is fixed. Everything, all of the problems are eliminated, all of our big mistakes are rectified.
We wish.
I think so, but tell us, how did you know that this was what you were going to do, and how did you figure out how to do that?
My father very happily suggested it when I was still in college, and I, along with the encouragement of my advisor, convinced the head of conservation at the Worcester Art Museum to give me an internship. I think he thought it was easier to take me on than to have me dogging him all the time. And at the same time, I worked for a local conservator who has he was Italian, and he really had a sense of both what you do with the craft, how you use a tool, how you use materials, and he was adamant about the fact that he was going to teach me how to do that. So I had a really lovely beginning of sort of the range of the spectrum. On one hand, the sort of museum protocol, and the other hand, the very hands-on approach that you'd find in a private practice. And then I moved to New York and worked for a private conservator again who treated both traditional and modern paintings, and I quickly realized that I was far more interested in modern and contemporary paintings than I was in traditional paintings, and rapidly transitioned to working for a man named Orrin Riley, who was a very eminent painting conservator at that time, who had both founded the lab at the Guggenheim and also maintained private practice. And he basically treated things from the beginning of the 20th century forward, so very much in the arena that I was most interested in. And I'd like to say a few words about Oren, because he was incredibly influential. He really was one of the first people to look at conservation from a really modern point of view. And he really strongly believed in minimal intervention, maintaining artist intention, and having the treatments be reversible on the principle that somebody at some point down the road is going to have to undo these. And this may not sound very revolutionary now because this really is sort of the prevailing thought, but to get people to get there from an era in which the idea was you treat things prophylactically so that you buffer them against the sort of vagaries of the world was really a change in philosophy, and I think a very critical change in philosophy. So anyway, I owe him a huge debt of gratitude. I worked with him until his death in 1986, and then continued his practice until 1994, when I set up Amman and Esterbrook Conservation Associates, where we focus on modern and contemporary paintings.
Wow. Is this true that you first encountered Robert Ryman by way of Oren Riley?
Yes,
Is that
absolutely.
okay?
Yeah. It was a lovely way to sort of happen into it. Oren and Robert had already a very long established relationship when I entered into the scene, and I think that it may have started with his inclusion in the show in 1966, or it may have started in 1972 when he had the retrospective at the Guggenheim. I'm really not sure about that. But they had a really very nice regard for each other, and we skipped one. This is Oren, and that's obviously Robert Ryman. And where's the painting of Oren? No, it's forward maybe.
Oh, forward, okay.
Forward. And apparently, Bob did not name very many paintings after people. In fact, maybe this is singular, but there is a painting called Oren, and I just thought it'd be sort of nice to put that on the screen. This is not actually Oren, because I don't have a slide of this. This is a painting that's in the show next door at Dia, but it is extremely similar. It's also a piece of linen that has been stapled directly to the wall with the blue snap line around it. So I just thought that was kind of a nice thing.
Does the Oren painting predate Arista, which is in the show, the work that we see here, or are they about the same time?
They're about the same time. I think Oren might be 67. It's what? Right.
We are now seeing the way in which art history should be done. Conservator meets archivist, coming together for truth, basically. I want to talk about how you started working with Ryman. How did this transition from you working with Oren, who's working with Bob, to then you actually working directly with Bob by yourself?
It was a little bit more gradual than that, because I started the first project that I did that I can remember anyway. I was still with Oren, but very much involved. They were both very kind about letting me, despite the fact that I didn't have a great deal of experience, about letting me be involved and being part of the process. And the first piece of his that I worked on was an entitled Prototype. And here are a couple of slides of Bob working on them. Next. Yeah. Next. And these are interesting. He varied the materials of these prototypes. Some of them are mylar, some of them are vinyl, some of them are spun fiberglass, but they were square formatted. They were applied to the wall with tabs of tape. So you'd have 2 tabs on the top edge and 2 tabs on the bottom edge, and then they were painted directly against the wall. And the little beard of paint that was formed by the overlap of the paint from the edge onto the wall was what actually held the attachment once Bob would take off the tabs of tape, creating the little voids that became part of the composition. So this is the first thing. Originally, they were done attached directly to the wall, and then later they were glued directly to the wall. And over a period of time, I think that Bob started to notice that this was perhaps not going to create longevity, and was concerned about another kind of presentation so that they would probably have their well-being might last a great deal longer, or we would hope anyway. So there were very specific things that Bob was concerned with these paintings. One was that he very much wanted to maintain the presence of the painting directly against the wall. He wanted to maintain that beard, that sort of fragile lip of paint that's going along the thing, and we do actually have a picture. Yes, there. And that the tape tabs should be as unchanged as possible. So we did a lot of research and sort of hunting around for different kinds of materials, and eventually came up with a plan where we found a panel that was a fiberglass honeycomb panel. No, go forward, I think. No, go back. Yes, sorry. Where you can see the back of the panel there, and you could put keyhole fasteners, which you could sink these little metal hardware things that would slide onto a screw and then slide down, so it's sort of lock in position, and it was very much tight with the wall. And we put a piece of ragboard on the face of the panel so that we would have some reflection from underneath, especially for the tape tab voids. And this was all then mounted with a thermoplastic adhesive. And one of the big challenges here was to support that little beard of paint, which we finally figured out how to do by using felts abutting the panels and then with nonstick paper on top of it, so you kind of make this little air channel that floats it during the mounting process. So that was, I think, the first thing that I worked on, and I was hooked.
Who comes up with the term prototype? Are you calling them prototypes? Did Bob call them prototypes?
Bob calls them prototypes.
Great. And why prototypes? Why, I mean, there are a lot of other ways that you could describe both this process and the resulting objects. Do you think that that word has any kind of resonance for him in terms of the rest of his practice?
I don't know, actually, to be honest with you. I don't think that he did preparatory kinds of things, so perhaps a prototype is just, it's the object. Yeah. I'm not sure.
I think this image that I mistakenly gave away early, which is this is the first time that I've seen this. Can you talk about what this magical thing is?
This is a sample test of various white paints that obviously Bob did in June of 1963, and this is again very much thanks to David Gray. There are a few of these where Bob would sort of do these little swatches of paint out onto a piece of fabric. And my assumption is that he was not only testing to see what the white paint looked like, but also how it handled and possibly what would happen to it over a period of time when he left it alone on this piece of linen. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, I think this is like a gift to conservation. So I find it fascinating and wonderful, and I think that they should be shown, actually. I think they're great.
And do you know if they have been shown? Are they?
I don't think so.
Have they been shown? They've not been. Wow.
Yeah,
What do you think the X's represent?
not the vaguest idea.
Does he write on the back which white he has used?
No. Not that I've ever seen, anyway. No.
So I want to think just a little bit about how this relationship began to evolve. What was it like working with him after this first kind of big project? How did you sort of ease into a relationship of working with him directly? Did you see him frequently? How did things kind of transpire?
We would see him off and on frequently. I think that when I'm the first studio that we had was at 61st Street, and he didn't really like coming to 61st Street because it was sort of too far uptown. So he would come, but more occasionally. But usually he would have things delivered. We would set them all up, and so that he would come and walk in and sort of, he'd make it a beeline for his work and not looking really to the right or left. And then we would discuss each one. Or if it was only one, then we discussed that one. But he had very, very specific kinds of things that he was concerned with, and he was very mild about how he would phrase them, but you could tell that there were things that really, really were important. And I never thought that as much as I felt like I knew the work and I felt like I sort of knew his vocabulary, I have to say that I never could entirely predict what his concerns could be. But it was a very interesting experience. It was kind of it was a big give and take. He would sort of suggest something, and he would think about it, and he would consider it, and maybe that would be incorporated into it, or maybe it wouldn't be incorporated into it. And he would say, well, these are the kinds of things, and we would say, well, as a response, like, these are things that we can do something about, these are things that we can't do something about. How do you feel about the fact that you can't, how do we balance that? And so it was a real interchange, but very quiet.
Wow. Can you explain to me what this is? And what we're to do with it, exactly?
I think you have to go back one.
Okay.
These are what I was going to talk about, what we don't do anymore and what we do now.
Okay, tell us what we don't do.
One of the things that has happened in conservation is that we have changed over the years because there's lots of different kinds of technologies that come in. There are advances in the field, and their sort of best practice is not something that's static, it's something that really sort of changes or evolves. And one thing, not to overuse these prototypes here, but one thing that has really changed is how we now mount these. And so much as we think that we developed this absolutely fabulous system in 1980 or 81, we now no longer do that. We now put them on it's called a die-bond panel, which has an aluminum skin with a polyethylene core, which is about half the thickness of the fiberglass panels, even at their thinnest. And the panel gets wrapped in paper. The prototypes are now hinged. They're not solidly mounted. So you end up both with something that has a more elegant profile, is more slender, and it also, if somebody ever needs to undo it, it's readily available. And this was all, we started doing this about, I think 2006 or 2007, under Bob's direction. So that now, as far as I'm concerned, sets a precedent for what we would continue to do should we mount another one of these things.
So how do we get from this to...
So, on the other hand, the little linen painting, we've been doing the same thing since I can remember and are unlikely to change it. So that's just a part of the puzzle which we're not going to be changing particularly. We don't have any better answers. We don't have another way of doing it that I think is more elegant or less intrusive. So these ones, occasionally we've taken them apart because one section of it, yeah, you could do that, has failed. And one of the things that can fail, and we're finally getting to this, is the adhesive that he uses to attach these things, because he uses a spot adhesive. And in this case, it's something called Hold It, which was really developed for posters like in your dorm room. And what we would do is we would measure the depth of these little pieces. We would make a template to see where they were, and then we would replace them with tiny little rounds of linen that we would build up so they would all be the right height and in the right position. So we wouldn't change the topography of it, and we wouldn't change it. We would change as little as we possibly could, and maintain his sort of closed system, including his corners, which he was very, very careful. He would bind they would have a piece of wood around the edges of them that would then be bound to the structure, keeping the glass with glazing on top of it. Sorry, I forgot that part. And he would then bind that with white linen tape. And he had extremely worked out ways of doing the corner, which he felt were the least intrusive ways in which you would then view it. So it was all very interdependent.
How long do you think it took him to develop that? And then how long did it take you to figure out that that's what he was doing? Or did this happen in a conversation?
Partially happened in conversation, partially happened from observation. I mean, he very much would, like if you were going to do something and you were going to replicate something, he expected that you would replicate it fairly exactly without him hitting you over the head about it. So it was just assumed that if we were taking one of these apart, we would be putting it back together in exactly the same fashion. So there's a lot of stuff that wasn't conversation. Mm-hmm. It just worked. It just worked.
Wow.
Yeah.
So there was a moment during the end of the installation of the show next door where all of my questions about what was really happening on the interior of some of these works were really just kind of bubbling up inside. And I'd bothered Sandra, let's be realistic here, I'd bothered her over and over about what is this, what is that, what is that? And finally there was a moment where she came and it was like the voice of God came and explained everything about what was happening with the three-dimensional works. And I know that some of the guides are here. You may remember the moment where we all sort of hugged around her to hear her explain how something like this not only comes to be, but comes to be on the wall in such a way. I'm hoping that you can tell us again, because I didn't get all the notes that I needed. We need to know. Yeah. But in all seriousness, though, I think this is interesting because this is a work that Bob is referring to as a painting, and
right.
Yet we are talking about something that exists in space in a very different kind of way. So,
right.
Yeah.
In a way, what I think he's doing here is he's taking his paintings and just sliding them down, but really the same elements are all in place. So you have metal fasteners on the back, you have metal legs on the forward part of it. The panel itself, which you see as a slender piece of wood, is actually a fiberglass panel with probably honeycomb on the interior that has a polished, super polished or mirrored surface on the top face. And then the edges are filled with wood, which there were a couple of choices for these panels. They were made by a stretcher maker in Brooklyn whose name was Josh Bagaya, and he would basically do pretty much anything that you asked him to do, or he would try and figure it out. I think that his background was engineering, although I was never quite clear on that. And what the choices on these panels could be, you could fill them with either white or sort of brownish bulked epoxy or with wood, and these were choices that I think were very carefully determined by Ryman. I think that he really thought about them and decided what he wanted in the place, and there was a reason in his mind why you would choose one over the other for particular things. So anyway, then on top of that is, I think, a fiberglass sheet, if I'm not correct, that's then painted.
Yes. Meryl just said that Paranavigation has 2 dates, 1984/2002. Why is that, Sandra?
Exactly. It was in a show, I think, in Germany, I'm not positive. And it came back and it had trouble. Yeah. Yep.
Can you all hear David's answer? Bob decided the work was in a show in Germany, and when it was returned, Bob decided to repaint the top part of it. Anything else? Yeah, Rob. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. 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 I mean, I think that's why I sort of think of it as sort of slipping down the wall in a way. Yeah.
Could you all hear Rob's answer about the work at Moma?
Please.
I was just confirming what Sandra was saying, is I think he was playing with all the variations he could on the horizontal that he had played with, not exactly the same ones because they're actually different orientations, but related ones on the vertical, so that the painting that is at Moma, which I bought, has a relatively matte and a relatively shiny white coat on top and bottom, and you look under and across it in one orientation and it's relatively high and it has narrow, long legs. This one, the fiberglass panel, is not rigid, so it has a different kind of effect when it goes white, not unlike the paintings that were tacked to the wall where there was a little bit of fluctuation in the surface. So I'm just saying he's thinking along all the same lines, except vertical and horizontal really are different, and fiberglass and canvas really are different, and so on. So.
Go back a little bit to talk about the test of the paint, because I think that this work has some kind of relationship to what we saw in that. The work that we had seen previously, where all of the paints are tested on the linen, we now have a work here that has, where its paint really has another kind of story that has changed this work in some ways. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yes. This is a work that is from 1964, it's an aluminum panel that Bob used something called New Masters, which was a vinyl-based paint that was briefly around in the 60s. And this is one of those cases where, as much as many of the things that Bob used have aged actually incredibly well, this was one that aged in a way that was entirely unanticipated. And as you can see, it has a sort of grayish mottled cast to it, and that is a consequence of its aging. And at first, Bob was fairly resistant to the fact that this was actually happening and the result of what these paints were going to be looking like. And we tried a variety of ways of intervening, and none of them even remotely successful, I might add. And I think that gradually over time, I was talking about this with my partner Elizabeth Estabrook, is that we sort of noticed over time that it didn't bother him anymore. That there was some kind of acceptance that, well, this is kind of what they look like. And we can now sort of step back and walk away from them a little bit. So I think it's just an interesting example of something that changes, but maybe you don't like it entirely, but maybe you end up thinking that, okay, that's all right.
It's interesting because the support, the metal is not really going to change very much, and yet that paint is evolving pretty quickly.
This happened pretty quickly.
So at 64, do you think that by the early 70s he could see the graying, or is this an 80s thing that he noticed?
I know that by the 80s it was happening, for sure. But whether or not it was happening before then, I wasn't around, so I don't really know. And I mean, maybe you could tell from photo documentation, I have no idea.
I know that we've talked a lot about, or I should say, I've talked to you a lot about scale and size and what happens earlier versus what happens later. Obviously, these are two works, and they, despite our kind of sense here that one is very, very small, they're actually both of a pretty large scale. They're on view next door, and one is from 58, one is from 82. Can you explain what happens in that period? Do you think that there are big changes in his work between the late 50s and the early 80s, where he's a very different kind of painter with a very different kind of career between that gulf?
I think there are huge differences. However, I also think there are huge similarities, and I think that's one of the things that I find endlessly fascinating about it, is that, yes, in the earlier one, obviously, it's more of a direct painting. It's many layers of oil, in fact, with some other colors sort of underlying them, on canvas, on a stretcher, on the wall. The later one is different to a degree. I mean, you have now the fasteners that are both holding it to the wall and projecting it forward, which are an integral part, obviously. But again, it is a square format, painted, layered on fabric, on a wood support on the wall. So as much as the two are remarkably different, I think that he also, he took materials and he could transform those materials into something different. It's not so much that they're different materials. Does that make any sense?
It does make sense, actually. I want to turn here to a final painting and ask you something that, I know that you've worked with other painters, and I know that you have a real sense of not only a working relationship with other painters, but working with their objects, which I imagine that you have a different relationship with each of these people. Is there any other painter or any other painting practice that you think has any relationship or resonance with Bob's?
I'm hesitant to make this comparison, but I do sort of loosely connect him with Agnes Martin, mostly because they're two artists that work in sort of a self-imposed, fairly tight parameters, but they produced enormous variation within the sort of stricture that they had set for themselves. I think that they are, however, remarkably different, and there's not really a huge basis of comparison, but the biggest comparison for me personally as a conservator is that I think that both of them require spending enormous amount of time with their work to really sort of get a good sense of it and sort of learn their language and the way that they're using a vocabulary to manipulate materials and to get to their end goal. And I think that's probably, to me, the biggest resonance between the two of them. And then I think that Eva Hess has some similarity just in terms of how adventurous she was with materials, which obviously Bob was remarkably so. But really, I think of Bob as being quite singular. I don't think that there's a great comparison to be made. I think he had a marvelous ability to use materials, to make them do what he wanted to do, and make the structure completely inseparable from what was on the surface. And I think it's been a remarkable experience for me, and really, truly a treasured aspect of my career, working on his paintings.
It's a wonderful place to stop. Yeah. Thank you very much.
So I think we'll go ahead and get started with the panel discussion. My name is Kirsten Swenson, and I see my role here as just making a few remarks and inviting everyone here to speak. There are many people with great expertise and wonderful background to share in the audience, so I hope we can have a sort of broad discussion. The range of voices on today's panel is, I think, what made it so dynamic and so interesting, really capturing this historical moment of when Ryman's work emerges in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, a period of great unresolve, which is a term that we've heard quite a bit today, and a period in which there were many different kinds of paradoxes to be reconciled. Two of the poles that sort of recurred in the panel in the various conversations were the material facts of the work, which of course Sandra drew out for us very nicely, and also this idea of silence that Fernanda emphasized, and the idea of art as something live, as something experiential, as something irreducible, which is perhaps akin to jazz. To quote Fernanda, the materials are always the same, but the works change all the time. So there is this kind of fundamental paradox within Ryman's work. Ryman himself drew on jazz, as John mentioned, describing his own work in terms of jazz. Quote, "Good art sets up a structure that everyone is familiar with, square mounted on the wall with paint on it, for example, and then departs from the expected tune." hopefully you'll be inspired to go home and think or blow your own horn, as Ryman put it. So one of the issues that I came around to in listening to the discussions today is, what is the role then of words, of art history, of criticism, for instance? And perhaps that's just from my own perspective, but it seems to me that Ryman's work does uniquely challenge the confines, of course, of art historical categories, but also of art critical frameworks. And this notion of a continually renewed, a continually transforming experiential approach to painting is something that I wanted to start with and get some thoughts on and reactions to, and perhaps in particular the place of words, the place of history.
Was for me, so.
Yeah.
This is a very difficult question, I think. First, because I don't read much art criticism, very little. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I don't read much, in fact, art criticism. I read very, very little and very, yeah. It is important to, art history is very important to make connections, mainly, I think, because everything is connected, very much connected. And just to give like some hints of yeah, I don't think I have nothing important to say in this matter.
I'll say something about pragmatism and writing. For me, when I was thinking about how to try to write something, I saw your amazing show when it was in San Francisco, and that was what made me fall in love with the work, and many years later tried to write about it, which for sure is the hardest thing I've ever written about. And the work doesn't exhaust itself ever, and I don't feel that the time I've spent on it is adequate, and I'm still curious and felt that this was such a wonderful occasion to come back to it and try to put it into words again, and it was equally difficult now with even more distance. But as a kind of philosophical framework, pragmatism was very helpful for me in thinking not only about the structure of his work and the historical connections between pragmatism and the Museum of Modern Art is something that I write about in the book-length study, but in terms of my own thinking about the possibility of writing about Ryman's work, it was also very helpful because I think pragmatism is precisely a philosophy that is a methodology, not a particular way of thinking. Or it's a way of thinking maybe, but it doesn't tell you what to think. And it's precisely predicated on things being hypothetical or conditional or subject to alteration, and belief systems being open and limber and kind of subject to the vagaries of knowledge and things that accumulate over time and become unlearned or unknown and refamiliarized in very different ways. So it gave me a way to think not only about the work, but also about the writing about the work that could also be a little bit maybe more hypothetical than more often allowed to be or told to be or encouraged to be in an academic framework where everything should be very airtight and tied with a bow. Pragmatism is very much a way of thinking against that or outside of that, where things are always subject to revision at later points, which isn't a kind of abdication of responsibility about an ethics of thinking or making a proposition in the present, but just a way of thinking about the fact that that is something, even for the same author, that could change.
Yeah, there's one thing about also to have another perspective. I think it's very interesting when you have another perspective, or you can have like a revelation of a completely different perspective from your own. And but it's true. I never had a formation but I just read a text which I really liked, which is Against Interpretation, which I never read before. But I'm much better a rereader than a reader, so I read it just one time, which for me is not enough. I think, yes, maybe this is the possibility to create connections mainly, or different perspectives. I think that for me, this is mainly the most interesting thing when I read texts about art.
I like that reference to Sontag, who, of course, calls for an erotics of art in place of a hermeneutics of art, and that sense of the experiential against the conditions of the world seems really relevant to Ryman. To change gears a little bit, I'd also like to ask about Ryman's continued relevance for painting today, especially from the vantage of Chelsea, where we are today, thinking about the earliest works in the show that date from the late 1950s, and how through the vicissitudes of painting over the past 6 decades nearly, Ryman has been incredibly consistent. And as painting has changed in many ways around him, and yet he seems as relevant as ever. Are there any thoughts on this issue of Ryman and painting, or perhaps not to speak so specifically to painting, but to art practice and his relevance for artists today? I don't want to be the only one talking. I mean, I'm going to put this a really glib way, but I feel like it's that old hackneyed thing about Picasso, like, oh, he took everything, or he kind of did everything. I mean, I think that about Ryman for the second half of the century. I mean, when you look around and you see, a very wide range of practices, I think there's a kind of DNA there that goes back, or that the propositions that he puts in the world, I think, have been infinitely rich for artists who are working now in all kinds of ways. But I think the maybe very profound difference there, it's not to say everything new is bad, I don't mean to make it like a kind of, dichotomy, but I think that his work to me feels much harder won, and that there's a real kind of consistency of purpose and formal or compositional or material decisions are generated out of so many possibilities, and you see them kind of arraying themselves into more of the same. But there's a structure underpinning this, and a kind of apparatus that seems so full and so fully intended. And I think that there's often now a way that appropriation happens, and I don't really want to, I feel like I'm like, don't think of the pink elephant, and then you think of the pink elephant. But I mean, with the whole kind of zombie formalism, or the kinds of conversations around a lot of abstract painting currently, I think there is there's a tendency for it to be very morphological, or appropriations that are very superficial without a kind of thought structure mooring them to themselves or to past precedents. And so that's where I would kind of think about a real difference, and maybe it would be an occasion for people to kind of give pause and think about how much richer projects or practices could be given space and time, which is also, I think, very much at odds with the system. So that's maybe more about kind of institutions and structures than individual works, but I think that is something to think about, the changed nature of the gallery system and the museum system since the 50s and 60s as well.
My personal theory is if an artist finds what he has to do urgently, it almost doesn't matter if he dies at 40 or 90. The urgency and the necessity are there endlessly.
never have time to do everything. So it's very nice that things goes on, things go on and on. So I hope, yeah, people get inspired by Ryman, because it's very rare in our art scene now, you know, and people need to see it really. And I think maybe this fact that you can't see it through image or reproduction, it's the thing that makes that the work will have a much slower influence, because much we have today is about image, and this has nothing to do with image, and it's the lack of you can't really spread it around. You can't see it. And this idea that you can't see it through a quick image, so it will take too long, not too long, I hope, but quite long because the most important thing, not the most important, but one of the most important things about an art oeuvre is that it can be transmitted to other artists. I think this is the kind of touchstone when the work is really important, when you start seeing it in others' oeuvres. So I think it will take longer because of this, but it's at the same time maybe it will be stronger in a certain way, because it will last as soon as the planet will, which maybe is not too much, but anyway, it will last forever. And when I was telling also about the material, it's just that you have the thing which is completely autonomous in its own existence, and the whole context changes all the time. But when you have a painting, as you can see from very old paintings, is still there, and it's a kind of incredible possibility that we have, that we can still connect with that immediately, even with the caves paintings. We can see them, even in I've seen ones for real, but even in reproductions, we can connect, or we can connect to art for 35,000 years ago, and we are still the same essence in a certain way. And we have no idea how was the experience of a man 35,000 years ago, but we can have a clue just seeing a sculpture or a painting. And
yes.
If the question is how does Ryman, how useful is Ryman now in a different context, how current is he, and so on and so forth, I think you have to back up several steps and say that the context of the present is defined by a whole lot of critical discourses, by a whole lot of careers, by a whole lot of predictions, most of which are pretty irrelevant, actually. And that when Bob started painting, there were a couple of clear-cut models. And the models mostly had to do with results and looks, things that were extrapolated from Cubism, extrapolated from a variety of movements, and the principal protagonist was Stella, but there were other people too. And so the idea was that the next move you made was a move that was an extension of these precedents. Bob's way of thinking about this is very, very different. It's very close to Solowitz's idea, that it is actually not formalism with a capital F that tries to complete art history. It's formalism with a little f that looks for the dynamics of form rather than the results. And that's what people who go to him now, if they go to him with their heads open as well as their minds open, should be doing, and saying, okay, now what is it that will gender new forms? What is the dynamic that we can work with? And not second guess art history and not say that's a stupid idea, that's not enough, I'll bypass that one. You know, how dumb is it to paint paintings that are square and white? I mean, obviously, as you said very well, they're not all square and white by any means, but if you reduce anything to a formula like that, then you talk yourself out of doing it. But if you have a sense that by focusing on a couple of variables, but all of the variables within that set, and then really working the changes, then things emerge. And then as they emerge, and it's the musical analogy as well. I mean, how many notes are there, right? How many versions of the blues format are there? How many versions of the, whatever format? Yeah, it's when you are a true formalist rather than a capital F formalist, when you're making art, not trying to make art history, that all these things open up again. And I think this is actually a very good time, since a lot of young artists, and I have been teaching them now for years, are really flummoxed, and they're scared, and they're confused. And now is a really good time to say, okay, trust your instinct. If you just can't get enough of worrying this small problem, worry it, please, and worry it fresh.
My remark goes back to your first question, but it's prompted by Rob's remark. You asked, what bearing does art history have on speaking about Ryman? Was that the question? I would say his work was always embedded in history. Every work of art, every artist is embedded in history. So the art history is already there, and he enters in a certain moment of history. And Rob's remark talks about how somebody like him and LeWitt, I would throw in Bachner, a few others, are sort of setting up a different way of working. It's emerging sort of at the end of a certain modernist narrative, Greenbergian narrative of a kind of medium specificity, and thinking beyond that about a kind of a set of variables. That's the way Rob describes it. You describe it as a set of takes. There's many ways to talk about his method. But it's emerging historically at a certain time. And what art history can do is it can sort of retrieve the historicity of the work of art, whether Ryman's or Picasso's or anyone. Art is embedded in history. So art historians, their task is to sort of retrieve the historicity of the work of art. And the historicity of Ryman is not just an art that's opening up a set of, a way of working that's different from a kind of modernist practice. It's also, I've sort of thought about a kind of morphological reduction. It's emerging, at the same time as Stella's black paintings and Robert Morris's sort of minimal cubes, and there's this kind of attempt to sort of think about the morphology of form, and it was called minimalism. And the word arises to speak about work like Morris's and Ryman's, and that's historical too. That term emerges historically then around these practices, and there's this attempt to sort of, reduce, but of course that reduction is completely incorrect. It's an opening, and it's complex, and there's nothing reductive about it at all. But precisely because it seemed reductive, it produced a great deal of discourse. It produced art history. It produced criticism, precisely because it wasn't providing easy discourse. It was discursive in its very absence of a kind of obvious, how do you talk about this stuff? And so everybody kept talking about it. And so it produces art history. It emerges art historically, and it produces art history. It produces discourse. Ryman's particularly, there's a huge literature about it. So it's embedded in history, and it produces art history.
The great proliferation of terms like anti-form, process, conceptual, minimal, etc.
Let me, and I'm a big fan of James's, so this is a response, not a counter. But I mean, if you think, okay, there's no artist that we can think of Bob's generation, other than Saul and a few others, who was as steeped in art history visually without having studied it. Right? I mean, he worked as a guard at the Museum of Modern Art, and Bob had talked about, watching Rothko in the presence of his own paintings, about becoming aware of the edge around the stretcher of Rothko's paintings is a factor which is crucial in so many things, including that orange painting that was shown, which has all kinds of stuff going around the edge. But there's also then in the modern, there's Malevich's composition White on White, 1918, 1920. And I remember talking to Bob about it, and he sort of brushed it off, right? Now, what do I take from that? Not that he's denying it, but that he's not satisfied with it. Also, at the same time, Philip Johnson gave a number of key Guston paintings, the ones that are based on Mondrian's Plus Minus. And of course, there would also be Mondrian's that he would have looked at. But again, I don't think he missed those things. I think he was not satisfied by them. Whatever they awakened in him was not satisfied by looking at those examples, and therefore that becomes the sort of predicate for inventing new possibilities out of old possibilities. But that's not influence in the way most people understand it, right? It's like, it's an irritation. A painter is irritated by another painter not doing what they should have done with a proposition that is really interesting.
I think it happens a lot when you see something that you can see also what could have been because there are so many possibilities that also seeing a painting, you can see a series of paintings that could have been done with the same propositions or the similar propositions. You can see the whole world of, and in fact, nobody have the conditions to do all of them. Nobody have the conditions to do everything that it's possible, even in your own propositions. And this is what I think it's so important to the work to circulate, because if you don't circulate the real work, you in a certain way you block some developments that just can happen when you see it, because inspiration also can be the opposite of what you see, or you can be very much inspired by other people's mistakes also, which is very nice, not only by your own mistakes, much easier even to be inspired by others, the mistake of the others, or even but yeah, anyway.
I was thinking, when first saw what Ryman was saying about learning to use paints and so on, it made me think that in the 50s, there were a lot of people doing something similar to that. I'm thinking of, well, maybe the most startling was Ornette Coleman, who came in looking like less than an amateur. He looked like a crazy person, and that's the way they talked about him, except for a few intellectuals. And that's because he was saying things like, people say, you're playing sharp. And he said, well, you can play F sharp sharp, and you can play F sharp flat. Or they say, well, you're not respecting the tonal center of the music and the tonic chords. He said, what is a tonic anyway? Well, half the time he's being honest. He didn't know. But the answers he got back were worse than not knowing. He worked up a language with this that would, people say, what key are you in? Don't worry about the key that's in your purse. At the same time, there were people who had a more traditional approach, like George, make sure I'm thinking here, I'm blocking his name, a rather obscure musician who not only questioned what was going on, he questioned the entire scalar structure of Western music. He said he would demonstrate this. He'd play a C scale and say, here are the first four notes. We get up to F. Notice something wrong when you go from F to G? And damn it, it's true, you can hear something wrong. He said, the entire scale structure of the West is wrong. It should have been, who am I thinking of here? It should have been in a Greek mode, which had long been lost. No one has dared to touch that statement since then. What if the entire history of the West's music was built on a mistake? It had to do with the making of the piano. And there were already arguments in the 1600s about something going wrong in that, so maybe it is true. I'm trying to think of some other people who would have done the same thing. George Russell was the name I was trying to come up with. What happens is it affects a small number of people, but no scholarship develops to talk about it. Nothing at all. It's lost. And particularly today, the way music is taught in schools, they don't teach history of music, they teach techniques. It's as if every class was about brushes and brush strokes. As if everybody said, this is the way you do it. And then you make up some stuff and you say, do this. They wiped out that other kind of stuff. I remember talking to George Russell about the activity around 1954, 55 when Ryman got into New York, and he said we were living in the golden age. And he would go into great detail. You could go to rehearsals for free. You could park your car anywhere if you had a car. You could hear Stravinsky premieres. And I said, when did the golden age end? He said, it was over between 1952 and 54. And I've come to think he may have been right. There was, when Ryman says, I wanted to know how the paint would act, isn't this kind of a basic question? Move to Thelonious Monk. Monk appears to be, he's asking the question in the way he plays, why did these notes go together? What holds them together? Why should this note come after that note? So in something I left out of my talk in a piece called Misterioso, he walks up the scale like this, repetitively, and then when he starts to improvise, he's only hitting a note here and there, and when he plays it at the end, he scattered that original jumping all over the keyboard. And so people would call it pointillistic. That's the way that was reviewed, a painter term. These people were really questioning how music, what it was. The idea of what holds it together. The next step, of course, was to eliminate those things in the late 60s, and there's where Ryman said, let me out of here. When there was no longer a frame around the picture, when it wasn't on the wall anymore, he didn't want any part of that. Am I right? Doesn't he say it has to be in the frame? Well, I'm talking about Ryman's, back saying he couldn't relate to that. He was not interested in free jazz. He didn't like all. He wanted the chords. You could do something over the chords, but you always had to have them. You could change it, you could change the chords themselves, but you had to have that frame. And there was this horde of people coming in from strange places saying, that doesn't mean a thing to me. Where'd those chords come from? Who says you have to do that?
Bob one time said he would love to go up into outer space where there was no gravity, and then he would put down. Bob once said he would love to go up into outer space with, astronauts where there was no gravity and lay down a brush stroke without gravity.
We have a comment in the fourth row.
I was struck by your comment about silence. Because to me, if you stand in front of a painting, you need silence. And therefore, I want to go back to what's going on in the museums today, which is there's a text that tells you how to look at it. And I think people are so used to having words and reacting with the words that they don't use their eyes. And to me, Ryman is all about eyes. You really have to look. And you have to spend a lot of time looking. And so what we can do with having everybody read the text before they look.
Okay, visual language has its own vocabulary, but also you have some, about thinking, and then I think it's better to think with your own mind than just, it's always interesting if you can read something afterwards and then you say, oh, interesting, I hadn't thought about it, or this was not even, oh, great, I thought something similar to it, or then you learn some things that you had no idea before. But I think, this also, it's a kind of system which is evolving in this way each day more, which I think it's also very complicated for what it horribly called general public, because first people think that they need to understand something, or understand what? Do you understand about yourself? You understand about life? What you need to understand about art? Just the idea that you need to understand a painting for me just don't fit, or...
And of course, art history is terribly important in terms of then going and knowing if you like this, what is it and how is it connected?
Art history, I think it would have a very important role to also to how to present the work when you do an exhibition, or how should you really make it, you know, and not only to produce a text, but to especially to produce perfect context, or as perfect as possible, a context that will allow people to, especially when the artist is not doing it himself. You know?
Do we have any questions from the audience? We do have a couple here. Would you like to go first, John?
It wasn't a question, it was just a comment about being with Bob and talking with him about a painting that I had seen of his, and I said, Bob, I see around the borders it says painting without paint, painting without paint. And he said, you're not supposed to see that.
Another question here, Lynn.
My question is, I've always come to Ryman's work thinking about Rothko, right? Like, you know, I'm always making the jump backward, then making the jump forward. And, you know, Rothko talked about his forms as performers, right? And so that there was this sort of kind of a psychological way. I don't want to use the term theatrical, but more like they were organic. They were alive for him, right? And at any point, would Ryman be interested in thinking about his work in that way, or about a kind of psychological way of thinking about it? Or was it so much, because clearly, you know, talking about the physicality of it and the materiality, and you know, you have sort of that end to it. But is there a sense of a kind of spiritual aspect to the practice, or psychic? Can anyone answer that question, maybe?
We probably have several experts who can speak to this. So who would like to jump in? Suzanne, Rob, James. Anyone else?
You know, Bob talked about his work in terms of enlightenment and all kinds of qualities that could be called spiritual, but he's in no way whatsoever, that I know of, making pictures in the way that Rothko did, which were symbolist pictures about metaphysical states. I mean, the whole literature of Rothko's paintings, of Clifford Still, of that generation, is totally alien to what he was up to. So I think he believed that in the present, here and now, experiential world, one could have a kind of, you know, liftoff. But the liftoff wasn't to someplace else. It was a liftoff in the space you were occupying with the things you were seeing.
This enlightenment, as I heard, or as I read his own statements, to be just a much more simple in terms of enlightenment as dare to know, or really dare to know, to not. I don't think there's any metaphysics involved. I don't think so either.
And it's nice that's the case, because at least I have that experience. That means I can do without metaphysics.
There's too much mystery without metaphysics already, isn't it?
So we have time for one more question, and in the blue, in the fourth row.
So I have a very simple technical question. After the conversation between Sandra and Courtney, which was so fascinating, I went back to the gallery and looked at how works were installed, like I think many of you did. And when I looked at Arista again, I was wondering about those staples, because I mean, it looks as if it's directly stapled to the wall, but then I'm almost sure you don't make new holes every time you install it. So perhaps you can elaborate upon this.
I didn't hear a word of it. I feel like Dave Liebman, who got called to a recording session once with Miles Davis, and everyone had headphones on, and he could hear a click going, and they pointed to him, play. He had no idea what key they're in, what the tempo was. That record is available now, by the way. He had no idea what was happening. No one could hear him. I'm right there. I could try answering something I didn't hear.
Sandra had pointed out that Arista is very similar to Orin.
To Orin, yeah. And the staples are replaced every time it's put in, as you suggested. And I mean, as a conservator, I would prefer that you use the same staple holes. But I don't think that that's always been the case, and I don't think it was necessarily the intention. I think at this point in time, since it has been often on the wall a number of times, that when it's installed, actually the staples are hand-held and then tapped into place so that you're preserving as much as humanly possible. Was that the question? Yes. Okay, good.
So do we have time for one more? We have time for one more question. And
just to finish
yeah,
this
please.
question, are there instructions from the artist for where to put those staples, or you guys just...
There are staple holes. So from the beginning installation, he had stapled it directly onto the wall, so you have already something to follow. And I don't think he necessarily intended you to put them in the same place every time, but if you want to do that, they're there.
Go ahead, Rob.
And now in my official capacity, because I'm involved in the foundation, we have collected a lot of observations by Bob about the installation of his work. I'm just speaking in my capacity as somebody involved in the foundation. We collected a lot of information from Bob about the installation of the work and what the sort of tolerances or leeway is. There is a good deal, actually, and he was concerned that things not be done in a sort of rigid imitation of something documented in photographs, because it shows up and it's lifeless. So one has to be careful not to damage work. One has to be careful not to invent wholly new systems unless they're within parameters that Sandra knows better than I. But it has to remain a living thing, and art is a living thing, particularly this art, which doesn't separate itself from the room with a frame, which doesn't separate itself from reality by a metaphysical penumbra. It's here, and it's now, and it has to remain on those terms with the viewer whenever the viewer encounters it.
Also about the light, because I was reading some things from his own statements about the light. First, that the proportions of the room and the light, and there is any instructions about the light?
To my knowledge, there are no absolute prerequisites. There are, of course, conservation issues. You don't want to burn paper. You don't want to put light on a surface that is reflective in a way that the eye bounces off of the surface. I mean, there are all kinds of conditions, and that's why, actually, curators will never go out of work, and neither will conservation people, and smart curators talk to conservation people and vice versa, because between the two of them, they're the custodians of the conditions under which we see things that somebody else has made.
Well, I think, unfortunately, due to time, we have to conclude here. But thank you, everyone, for being here and for your questions.